down toward the mic.
The next presentation is going to be by Andy Heilman on creation as conservatism.
Conservatism? I thought it was liberal.
Conservation is
perpetual creation. Yes. Okay. Good enough. Thanks, Ron. Okay, well, it's fun to be here. Been a long time. I have to thank Ron and Forrest for starting this group up and roping us in. And we've had a lot of fun Mondays at 10 o'clock by Skype. That's probably why we're all old guys, because young guys don't have 10 o'clock on Mondays free. So, at any rate, nice to see you. We're going to start with this one. It's Hans Sloane's Bird. Okay, and I'll just read some. I'm going to read the whole number because it's an amazing teaching. Okay. I heard two presidents of the English Royal Society, Sir Hans Sloane and Martin Folkes, conversing together in the spiritual world about the existence of seeds and eggs and their productions from them in the earth. The former ascribed them to nature and contended that nature was endowed from creation with a power and force to produce such effects by means of the sun's heat. The other maintained that this force is in nature unceasingly from God the Creator. So to settle the discussion, is that the teaching? Nope, I'll use buttons. There we go. To settle the discussion, a beautiful bird appeared to Sir Hans Sloane, and he was asked to examine it whether it differed in the smallest particle from a similar bird on earth. He held it in his hand, examined it, and declared there was no difference. He knew indeed that it was nothing but an affection of some angel, represented outside of the angel as a bird, and that it would soon vanish and cease with its affection. And this came to pass. By this experience, Sir Hans Sloane was convinced that nature contributes nothing whatever to the production of plants and animals, and that they are produced solely by what flows into the natural world out of the spiritual world. If that bird, he said, were to be infilled with its minutest parts with corresponding matters from earth, and thus fixed, it would be a lasting bird like the birds on earth. He goes on to say, to this he added that had he known what he now knew of the spiritual world, he would have ascribed to nature no more than this, that it serves the spiritual which is from God in fixing the things which flow in unceasingly into nature. And so the natural world, what we see and touch, is actually, what we see is actually spiritual. We think of it as concrete, external. And about years ago, they were asking ministers what their favorite teaching was. And this one was George de Charmes. You'll notice that was the first picture I found of him, and then I got another one later. This is actually George de Charmes here. Now, the teaching concerning Sir Hans Sloane's Bird, recorded in Divine Love and Wisdom, 344, is of tremendous importance to the new church. It applies to all living creatures that have ever been created on earth and indicates how they are to be regarded as representative forms of use. It is the constant teaching of the writings. After he quotes the number, he goes on. This is George of Charms again. It is the constant teaching of the writings that material substances are not part of the living embodiment of any organism that is grown from seed. The function of the mineral kingdom is to clothe, fix, and render permanent the living body of any vegetable or animal creation. The real body of any living creature is a representative form of use. If we identify the living organism with the material substance that clothes it, we fail to see the divine purpose for which it is created. We regard it then as a marvelous mechanism that has no connection with the divine source of life. It conveys no message of love and wisdom from God to man and performs no spiritual or eternal use to mankind. Does anybody recognize that bird on the top? You might recognize the bird on the bottom. That was the bird the Chinese emperor liked so much on the bottom. It's a nightingale. So which bird do we see? That's really what it's all about here. What bird do we see? Do we see a marvelous mechanism with no spiritual use, with no connection to the divine? Or do we see the spiritual bird? Now, this is just a picture, so I brought my rooster. Okay? It's a very well-behaved rooster. We had a worship service in the woods. He was quiet. I even talked about roosters crowing. What's the use of a rooster? Well, one of it is, of course, to plant seeds so the hens can have chicks. But the other use of a rooster is a wake-up call. So I hope Banty here will serve as a wake-up call to us all. This is a spiritual bird. Everything you see about it is a spiritual bird because your mind's in the spiritual world. If this bird wasn't in the spiritual world, it wouldn't be here. And what's interesting is he saw a bird in the spiritual world, and by that was convinced, because he studied birds. As a matter of fact, the picture of the hummingbird up there, he was in Jamaica. He said it was the most beautiful bird he saw. So he was given a beautiful bird in the world, probably the same hummingbird, I don't know, probably not a rooster. But anyway, this is a beautiful rooster, by the way. And he saw, this thing looks exactly like the bird in the natural world. So he realized that the bird in the natural world is a spiritual bird. So in the same way, we should realize this is a spiritual bird with a few chemicals added so that it doesn't disappear when Vance stops thinking about it, right? See what I mean? In other words, this is real. So anyway, that's the theme of the talk. Minute, I'm going to take him out just in case he gets noisy. So, we don't have saints in the general church, do we? But that was Bishop Charms's reason for picking that number, was to slay the dragon and protect the woman clothed with the sun from thinking from our senses instead of from heavenly doctrine. So, he's not a saint. Actually, he worked one miracle with me. He just needs one more. It has to be after you die, and maybe he'll be moved to sainthood. Okay. I said enter Banty, but Banty's already come and gone, okay? So, now, this teaching is a marvelous teaching. Probably, folks, I won't read it all. I'll just read the very last part of it. It's 12. At the end of AE, there's a wonderful section on creation. You really have to read it. It's actually, in some ways, more interesting than Divine Love and Wisdom, because Divine Love and Wisdom was a published work, and therefore he had to bring it down a notch so most people could understand it. The unpublished books are marvelous. It's just doctrine straight from heaven. You're reading those, he doesn't have to polish it up, or I sometimes call it dumb it down for us. They're just unbelievable what they say, and this is one of the great numbers in the end of AE. I can positively affirm that the things which exist in the spiritual are even more real than those in the natural world. For that which is in nature is added to the spiritual is dead and does not produce reality, but rather diminishes it. So the bird in the spiritual world is even more wonderful. And then another number about the mineral kingdom. The mineral kingdom is simply a storehouse in which are contained and from which are taken the things which the forms of the other kingdoms, the animal and the vegetable, are composed. Think of a house going to be built. Now, you see all the lumber there and all the different building materials. Now, if you didn't see builders and the house started coming together, you would think that it was the properties of the wood and the glass and the stone and everything that made the house. You would actually believe that because you didn't see the builders. Well, most of the Lord's building is hidden from us. So we actually attribute to the chemicals what is really coming from the spiritual world. Here's a wonderful illustration here. This is a ruby, a diamond, and graphite. Now, which of those two materials has the most in common? If you know your chemistry, you'd probably say the diamond and the graphite. Both of them are pure carbon. But if you know, and most people would say the diamond and the ruby. They both correspond to similar things. It's truth in the celestial heaven. A ruby actually takes oxygen and aluminum and puts on the form of a diamond. That's why its hardness is 9. It's the second hardest substance. A diamond, of course, is a hardness of 10. But a ruby mimics the form. In other words, there's an inflowing into those substances. It puts the substances together. It doesn't come from the carbon or the aluminum or the oxygen. It comes from the spiritual form using the materials. Writings talk about influxes, coming down and finding subservient means in the atmosphere below to put together to make it work. So I'm going to read this number, and then I'll skip quickly because we're running late. But This is just a beautiful teaching. Whenever you want to get inspired, go to Divine Providence number 3. It is just absolutely incredible. So let me read it from down here. That the universe with each and all things of it was created from the divine love by means of the divine wisdom can be confirmed by all things submitted to sight in the world. Select any particular object and examine it with some wisdom, and you will be convinced. Take a tree, or its seed, or a fruit, or its flower, or its leaf, and gather up the wisdom in you. Examine the object with a good microscope, and you will see wonderful things, while the interiors that you do not see are still more wonderful. It's just incredible. Our microscopes are better and better, and what's amazing is people see less and less of the divine in them. It goes on to say, observe the order in its development, how the tree, from seed even to new seed, and consider whether there is not in every successive step a continual endeavor to propagate itself further. For the final thing to which it aims is seed, in which its reproductive power exists anew. And if you are willing to think spiritually, which you can do if you wish, will you not see wisdom here? Moreover, if you're willing to go far enough into the spiritual world, will you not also see that this power is not from the seed, nor from the Son of the world, or which is pure fire, but is in the seed from God the Creator, whose wisdom is infinite, and in it not only the moment it was created, but continually afterwards. For conservation is perpetual creation, and subsistence is perpetual existence or coming forth. In fact, if you are willing to go far enough in spiritual thought, every such created thing is endowed with power. But power acts not of itself, but from him who bestowed the power. Examine any other object in the earth, a silkworm or a bee or any other little creature. Look at it first naturally, afterwards rationally, and at length spiritually. And if you are able to think deeply, you will be astonished at it all. And if you let wisdom speak within you, you will say in amazement, who can fail to see the divine in these things? All things are of the divine wisdom. Now, that's what we can do. And we talked about theistic science, but there was some of that going on way back in 1744. About the time Swedenborg was writing, a man named Maupertuis came up with a fundamental principle called the principle of least action, which is still very much in vogue. As a matter of fact, it's really in quantum mechanics and other things. I'm not going to read what he says except the very last sentence here. This action is the true expense of nature, which she manages to make as small as possible in the motion of light. And so if we look at this slide, why does light bend when it goes through glass? Notice the question why. Teleology, purpose. Because it wants to go from point A to point B, and that is the path of least action or least time. If you had a marsh in front of you and you wanted to get to one city from another, you'd cut the corner a little bit through the marsh to save time. You wouldn't go perpendicular, but nor would you go straight in a straight line, because you're going to be going slower there. So you want to minimize the time that you spend in the slower medium. And light does this. Another neat example is, how many of you have ever driven from San Francisco to Las Vegas? Well, if you got the gambling urge, you can take the green route. If you want to see beautiful scenery, you'll take the shorter route, but it takes more time, right? So notice they skipped Los Angeles, probably because of the traffic. They got off the superhighway. But the point here is there seems to be purpose in creation. And this is something that Maupertuis saw. He says it this way. One cannot doubt that everything is governed by a supreme being who has imposed forces on material objects, forces that show his power, just as he has fated those objects to execute actions that demonstrate his wisdom. In other words, they seem to know where they're going. And the last sentence here, this is about the ancients. When they said that God occupies himself with geometry, they surely meant that he unites in that science the works of his power with the perspectives of his wisdom. Sounds a lot like conjunction of love and wisdom. And then 1744. But people, if you go back into science and study the physicists of the day, it was all about how does God do stuff. I don't know if you'd be able to teach it. I think you might get away with it in a school, probably not a high school, but maybe a university, showing how they came up with these different views based on what they thought God did. One of Newton's problems was God was acting at a distance, and they felt he should be right there. So there's a lot of interesting things going on there. Well, so it's a matter of opening our eyes. These are a couple of famous quotations from the Heavenly Doctrine. Thought from the eye closes the understanding, but thought from the understanding opens the eye. This is the quote I wish they had put on the billboard on 95. And then, because this attracts people. If you think from your understanding, you can see things. But if you think from your eye, you don't understand them. And then it goes on to say that faith is the eye of love. Faith is belief. It's the eye of love. You can see it if you love it. And the necessity of the affirmative principle. And of course, in the first section there, AC 127 to 129, it's talking about the choice. We have two trees. Both beautiful to look at, but only one can we eat of. We have to make our choice. So there's a fun thing here. How much more time do I got? When did we start? I want to honor my clock here. What? Okay, good. This is about where I thought I'd be. Okay. So how does the eye see? Well, we know about how the light comes in. I took this picture out of the thing of how the eye saw, but I changed it a bit. I snipped out the thing. Our eye sees, our eye doesn't see, right? That's what the number says. It says, the rays of light convey with the wings of ether the forms and colors into the eye, and these forms, when perceived in the eye, are observed by an internal sight that is called the understanding, and are distinguished and recognized according to their quality. I've often thought when a baby's learning to focus, what they're really doing is they're trying to focus what they love with what they see with their eye. In other words, their spiritual eye is pretty well open, but their natural eye, they have to coordinate those two. And so that's where the focusing time comes from. It's not just physiological, it's actually mental. And so the understanding is our spiritual eye. And if there wasn't a spiritual flower, we could not see it. They had that image. You see how I took it out of the brain? The image isn't in the brain. The image is in your mind of what you see. There's light coming into your eye, and there's all that neat focusing, but that's where the image is. Now, the number goes on with some really neat stuff, which I'm not going to talk about hardly at all, but you really want to read AE 1146 at the end, where it gives the laws inscribed on the nature of all things, both spiritual and natural, if you get the context, are in harmony, which laws are, and this is how the eye sees they're in harmony with. Nothing exists from itself or is acted on or moved by itself, but only by something else. And then it goes on to, it sounds a little like Newton's first law, but then he goes on to point out this is not from another, but from itself in the living force, which is life, meaning the Lord is the prime mover. The second law is a lot like the third law about two forces, which is what they were talking about, light flowing in from the world and spiritual light flowing into the mind. The two have to come together. For every spiritual force, for it to be something in the natural world of God, has to be a natural force as well. The two meet. If you study Newtonian physics and you want to know how you walk, the floor pushes you forward. But which is the cause? But without that floor, you're going to be just like a roadrunner, going like this. You need to have an external force. And where science makes its mistakes, it takes the external force and calls it the cause. But it's merely the effect. It's merely the foundation on which it rests. It's one thing that gives it fixity. The next law here is two forces at rest produce an equilibrium. And when it's put in action, it moves out of equilibrium. And then it wants to seek to go back to equilibrium. Now, you might not see Newton's second law here unless you looked at what D'Alembert did with this law, which was basically F minus ma equals 0. There's a dynamic equilibrium going on. It's actually the principle of least action in another form. And then the last law, all activities are changes of state and variations of form, and the latter are from the former. It's not by accident that Schrodinger called the equation. I don't know. Ian, did he call the equation of state, or was that somebody else? They saw that. What about Schrodinger's equation? We were told that was the equation of the state of the particle. Okay. Okay, thank you. At any rate, you find the forms. First, you need the equation of state, then you do some eigenvalue stuff to it, and you see the forms as well. It's fascinating. So at any rate, there you have one of the fundamental principles of quantum mechanics, third law number 4, sort of added on. But the forces I really want to talk about with what little time we have here is the active force, the creative force, and the formative force. There's not just influx from the spiritual world, there's also immediate influx from the divine, his omnipresence, his omnipotence, his omniscience. And that's the active force. It says this is spiritual. Because it is spiritual, it proceeds from the fountain of all forces, which is the Son of Heaven. That is the Lord's divine love. And love is the active itself, from which the living force, which is life, proceeds. So that is the active force. And this active force is uncreate or not creatable. And so we get a list in TCR of the things that aren't creatable. Obviously, the infinite isn't creatable. Love and wisdom are not creatable. Consequently, life is not. But it goes on to say light and heat aren't creatable. And even activity itself, when viewed in itself. So the active force is the presence of the Lord in nature everywhere. But then we have correspondence, or the creative force. And this creative force is like an influx. It goes through the spiritual world and puts on the natural. And that creative force is like that bird that you looked at. It's the spiritual bird, it's a creative force, and by correspondence, you get the natural bird made of spiritual natural substances. So these birds, for the first continually regards the last as an end, and unless the first look to the last continually from itself through the intermediates, according to the order of creation, all things would perish. Therefore, productions, which are, especially animals and plants, are continuations of creation. It doesn't matter that the continuations are affected by seeds. It is still the same creative force that produces. So the constant correspondence of that spiritual bird and that natural bird is really the cause. But it's the cause, but it's not the end in view. That's coming from the Lord's love. And the force that I'm going to look at a little bit more here is what's called the formative force. Now we can see the formative force in the solar system around us. In many ways, all we see when we look at the universe around us is the formative force and the active force. We don't really see the creative force, all the plants and animals. Why? Because we're not there in the spiritual world with that creative force. We're in our spiritual world. And so we see the creative force in our spiritual world, our world of spirits. But to see it, you have to be there in a living way, not just a dead way. At any rate, this is a great number about the formative force, that it's dead in itself. And it talks about how heat and light from the sun are that. Now, this heat and light is the physical things, the atmospheres and stuff that come forth. And then it ends with this quote. He who believes that the heat and light of the sun of the world do anything more than open and dispose the things proper to nature, that they may receive influx from the spiritual world, is very much deceived. The writings say this all the time. It's a great little section here. This is also in that section at the end on creation, at the end of AE. Now, this is what science has today. It's fairly accurate still. It slips in a little glue on there, I think, at the strong force level and pi nucleons and stuff. At any rate, this is a flat. All these forces to science are acting at the same level. But Swedenborg, when he did the Principia, I'll go through this rather quickly, he actually had 5 elements, and he had them in successions, in discrete degrees to each other. That's how Swedenborg saw it. So the first degree he called the universal element, or the vortex around the sun. We can see that picture here more as a vortex, and it reminds us of general relativity and the gravity well. The vortex around the sun, gravity. And it's defined as gravity. The next one, Swedenborg spends about half the Principia on, is magnetism. So he calls that the second element. And then he goes to the third element. Here's his picture of the ether. Right. This is his third element. And then we get to, this is an interesting one. He says about the ether is urged into a whirling motion at a distance from its body, and this causes light and, to a certain degree, electricity. So Swedenborg was seeing, even in his Principia, the connection between light and electricity. So I don't know if Ben Franklin read this and decided to go out with his kite to find the connection, but it later is seen. And then the last, well, this is the fourth element, air. That was the picture in the book about air. And the last one is water vapor. So he had 5 elements. When he got to the spiritual diary, he gets them down to 4 in the early diary. Air, ether and light, magnetism, and probably gravity. He calls it the purest ethereal sphere, is one that is universal in the whole world. And by world, he calls it the solar world. The solar system is called the world in the heavenly doctrine. He only talks, though, in the Arcana Celestia about 2 of them, the air and the ether. And fascinating, this very last thing about the ether, he says, and the air, he says, that this is so the case of, that whatever secret thing has been stored in the nature of the air and of sound is inscribed on the organism of the ear. And whatever secret thing has been stored in the nature of ether and light is inscribed on the organism of the eye. And we do see, if I can get my pointer here, the lens takes advantage of the wave property of light. The retina, the particle property of light. So the wave-particle duality of light was inscribed on the eye. And who knows how many other secrets are in there. Color, all sorts of things. All the secrets of light and ether, as he calls it, are inscribed on the eye. And it would be nice, fun to study the ear and see if we can see all those harmonies. I mean, people don't want high definition, or what do they call it, Dolby sound, because their ear picks up all those fine things. Incredible what it does. So going on now. Where he really starts talking about 3 atmospheres again in the heavenly doctrine is in a little work called The Last Judgment Posthumous. Actually, not that small, but a manuscript. Thanks. And you got gravity, you have magnetism, and air. And Ian's going to talk a bit about this. This is where you start seeing the 3 degrees. And you know what he just did here? He united magnetism with light. Why? Because there's 3 heavens. I remember when I was a physics student, and ether was being disproved by Michelson-Morley experiment. My faith was shaken a bit. And I said to myself, you know, everybody believes science. I think I'll try believing the writings instead. Best choice ever made. It's just unbelievable. Turned out the ether that was disproved wasn't even around when Swedenborg wrote. Very different ether. It was a strange sort of thing they had, and, well, I won't go into all that. So there's a simple summary of the discrete degrees, celestial, spiritual, natural atmospheres in the spiritual world, and gravity, light, and electromagnetism. And gravity, then light and magnetism, and then finally air. And they come into substances. The substances of the celestial are goods. The substances of the spiritual are truths. Naturals are uses. I'm not quite sure what the substance of gravity is. I'm saying masses. I like that. But Ian's got a few things to say. That's actually one of the projects we've been trying to figure out. What goes on at the highest level in the physical. And then there's waves for the next one, and then down to particles. Now here's a neat little diagram. Some of you recognize this. This is Hugo Oedner's diagram in the book Creation. And we can get starting to see what's going on. I'm going to rush through this because I want to get to this last number. It should be known that the atmospheres rising from the Son of Heaven, which is the Lord, properly speaking, are not 3, but there are 6. 6 atmospheres from the spiritual sun. 3 are above the sun of the world, and 3 are below it. Wait a minute. Well, what this means, if we go back to our active and passive, active, creative, and formative forces, is when something is in the physical world, those spiritual things are in it. So you could call that spiritual bird out there is under the spiritual sun. I mean, under the natural sun. Even though it's actually spiritual, it's not in the spiritual world. It's in the natural world. You don't see the rooster walking around up there. He has a cloaking device on called chemicals. Angels don't see that rooster. Just as we don't see, as long as we think from our senses, we don't see the spiritual things. It's a trade-off. It's useful. And this number goes on to say, men in the world need the 2 lowest atmospheres to think. We think from our eyes and our ears. That's where our thought comes in, our understanding, especially linked to our eyes and our ears. And those atmospheres, those spiritual atmospheres, that are linked to our eyes and our ears make it possible for us to think from our senses, but to think. So it's a really useful thing. Now, does anybody recognize the author of that diagram? He sent it to me in an email a couple days ago, so he's alive. Yes. Somebody said it? Willard Heinrichs, yes. And he keeps working on this, and it would be great if he could get it a little bit more, printed up like Hugo Oedner's. But it's just an amazing, and even as an either-or, trying to explain that number from The Last Judgment posthumous. So here's the thesis. Okay. It would seem that the spiritual atmospheres above the natural sun have formative force in the spiritual world. Remember, because all three forces are there too. Thus, their forms are spiritual, and they can come and go with the spiritual states of those in the spiritual world. But the atmospheres from the spiritual sun, which are below the natural sun, our spiritual atmospheres are creative forces inflowing into the physical atmospheres are formative forces. Propagating and conserving the physical forms which give them fixity and presence in the natural world. If you want to see all these, the handout has quite a bit more than what I said. Now, there's your choice. You wanted a picture of correspondence, Reuben. There you are. We got a spiritual nightingale, and we got a natural nightingale. And they look exactly the same, according to what Hans Sloane saw. So, but the difference is the one up above. I can't point with my finger, won't work. The higher one, this one is in the spiritual world, and its substances are spiritual. They're much more real. This one, I think there's still nightingales around, I'm assuming, is natural. And it's how we see the nightingale. Do we see it as a spiritual bird with chemicals surrounding it to fix it in this world, or do we see it as a marvelous mechanism? I think in the end of the story, he went back to the nightingale, right? That's how it works. So let's go back to the nightingale. Okay, that's it.